Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Anne F. Baum Memorial Lecture on Elder Law. This endowed lecture series is an annual tradition here at Illinois and is made possible by a generous gift from the estate of Anne Baum. Mrs. Baum was born November 11th, 1922. A lifelong resident of the Chicago area, she grew up with 7 siblings, and she and her husband, the late Alvin H. Baum, operated an investment firm in Chicago. Mrs. Baum and her late husband were compassionate individuals who supported a broad array of charities as well as providing direct support to those in need. Beneficiaries of their giving included the disadvantaged, the young, the elderly, religious organizations, educational organizations, and civic organizations. Their legacy of giving and sharing is continued through the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund, of which both Alvin and Anne were benefactors. In remembrance of her life, a gift through her estate endowed the Anne F. Baum Memorial Lecture on Elder Law at the college. This lecture series seeks to promote the relevant and timely discussion of a broad range of issues relating to the intersection of public policy, the law, and the elderly. It constitutes a fitting memorial to a woman who is deeply concerned with the rights and issues pertaining to elderly people in our society. And so with her in mind, I introduce today's speaker. We are pleased to welcome an eminent legal scholar, Lee Fennell, back to the College of Law. Professor Fennell is the Max Pam Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, where she has been teaching since 2007. Before her time at the University of Chicago, she was a member of our faculty from 2004 to 2007, and I know that several of her former colleagues are here today to join me in extending a very warm welcome. Professor Fennell's teaching and research interests include property, torts, land use, housing, social welfare law, state and local government law, and public finance. A very influential and productive scholar, she has authored 2 books and numerous articles and essays. Last year, Professor Fennell was honored with the Brigham Canner Property Rights Prize at William and Mary Law School, an award that is presented annually to a scholar, practitioner, or jurist whose work affirms the fundamental importance of property rights. Of her selection, the director of the William and Mary Property Rights Project stated, quote, "Her work examining property's conceptual and social boundaries has almost literally helped to reshape thinking about property law, and the Brigham Canner Prize is a fitting tribute to her many contributions." Please join me in welcoming Professor Lee Fennell.
Thank you so much, Dean Sharp. I really appreciate that very generous introduction. And thank you all for joining me here today. It's a great honor to be giving the Anne F. Baum Memorial Lecture in Elder Law, and a particular pleasure to have been invited back to the College of Law and to get to see so many colleagues and friends again. So my talk today, Space Over Time, Housing for the Life Cycle, starts with 2 facts that are true of all living human beings. We all need housing, and everyone, all of us, are aging. And these things interact, it turns out. What people need from housing changes over time, and that makes housing a dynamic resource problem, both for individual households and for society more generally. Now, 2 features of that resource problem are, I suspect, familiar to all of us here. First, there's a housing crisis going on throughout the country, a dramatic undersupply and mismatch of housing. And secondly, the older segment of the population is growing dramatically. The over 65 and up sector and the age profile of society as a whole is skewing older. Okay, so a few statistics just to kind of set the stage. Here's sort of our general trend. You can just kind of eyeball that. The population 65 years and over by size and percentage of the total population, with projections of further increases. Okay, so again, we see this kind of expansion of this sector. Another trend that's really important when we think about housing is the growth in one-person households as a percentage of all U.S. households. Okay, and so in the later decades, it's broken out here to show by age, with the lighter sort of lavender at the top being ages 65 and older. So a substantial share of the one-person households are older households, older individuals, and overall we have lots more one-person households than we used to. Okay, now, just to give you another picture here, this is looking just at homeowners, owner-occupied households. If we kind of look over time and think about how homeownership is distributed through the age ranges, we can see some changes over time as well. So the green band here corresponds, I think you can maybe see on the slide, less than 35 years old, kind of starter households. And then the sort of peach and gold bands are 35 to 44 and 45 to 54, respectively, kind of times when at least typically, the peak household size will be reached as additional kids are added, maybe members of older generations might be added as well to the household. And then we reach the sort of blue and purple areas here, 55 to 64, 65 and over, when household size tends to be decreasing. And if you look at kind of this over time, you can see that the share of homeowners that are in the decreasing household size range is a bigger and bigger share as we're going forward compared to what it was, say, around 2000 or so. Okay, so that also has implications. So I want to preview with this in mind sort of the way forward. And actually, this talk has a very optimistic punchline. We might think that our story is like this, that housing's a big problem, we have to solve it for everyone, and then we have to figure out how to specifically solve it for seniors. And so a traditional way to think about this is that the demographic trends just amp up our difficulty level overall and layer on an additional kind of set of problems to an existing housing problem. But I want to suggest instead that we think about the relationship between these ideas a little bit differently and think about the arrow going both ways. The large cohort of senior citizens with housing issues can actually create tremendous political will to solve housing problems generally. And so I want to suggest that by focusing on housing for seniors and looking at how we can make housing more flexible and better for seniors, we can at least potentially assist with housing policy for all age groups. And so we want to think about the arrows going both ways. Sometimes two challenges can be better than one if the combination galvanizes support for meaningful change. Okay, so what kind of fixes do I have in mind? How should the case for these reforms be framed? Here I want to draw on two ideas from property theory that have featured heavily in my work and that I think apply in especially interesting ways when we're thinking about the problem of elder housing. Okay, the first of these is the idea that property is designed to deliver a stream of benefits to people over time. And the particular asset in question, like the housing unit, is just kind of a conduit for those benefits. The second idea that kind of comes from things that I've worked on and that I think is important generally is the need to adapt over time. The need to configure resources and reconfigure them as needed to meet new challenges. Okay? And so if we put these themes together in this context, we end up looking at how housing should be configured over the life cycle in order to deliver the residential services that people need throughout the life cycle. Okay, and both of these themes, by the way, challenge the dominant idea of property as being something that's fixed and static, and the related idea that property is only about protecting things from outside interference. Instead, I really see property's core job as enabling and managing flows of services from resources to people. And what's key in all this is configuration, reconfiguration, and reconfigurability of resources to keep those services flowing. Okay, so housing for older people is an especially good arena for thinking about this for a couple of reasons. First, it already seems somewhat intuitive to think about elder housing as being service-based rather than asset-based. And that's partly because seniors often need services along with their housing, and partly because we might start to define housing needs in functional terms as people age. We might think more about accessibility features within the home and accessibility, proximity to sites outside of the home and how accessibility features into that. Second, elder housing illustrates how changes, and here we're often looking at predictable life stage correlated changes, might require reconfiguration of the residential bundle along dimensions like space and time and even risk and financial dimensions. So elder housing offers some unique opportunities for pioneering ways to make housing work better for everyone. Okay, so I wanted to start by thinking in general terms about the services that housing provides, because there are several. And I have them here kind of broken out into consumption, production, and financial services. On the consumption side, houses provide certain kinds of very obvious services like shelter, privacy, storage, maybe aesthetics. They provide staging areas for all kinds of activities. They also, though, very importantly, are a portal for local goods and services that might be provided by the local government or in the community generally. As a production site, people, of course, might use their homes for different kinds of home production, things that are consumed either by the household itself or by other people, cooking, cleaning, childcare, knitting, I guess I have here on the slide. But additionally, we can think about the home as being a site of production of inputs into the larger neighborhood environment, because the people who are in a particular household are an input to social and associational and public goods in the area as well. On the financial and risk buffering side, there's a lot of things that people might be looking for their home to do for them. They might be looking for it as a form of financial security, a savings vehicle, a way of building wealth. They might be thinking of it as a place to share with family over time or to bequest to family after death. Additionally, people might think about their home, and especially if people are renting rather than owning a home, they might be concerned about thinking about its ability to deliver them a stream of consumption benefits over time at a predictable cost. Okay, so all these things may be important when we're thinking about the services that a home provides. And these services are, of course, not limited to the four corners of the household itself, but also implicate public goods and services outside, private land uses nearby, transit, shopping, parks, employment, all kinds of things that determine the value of the home to the people living in it. Okay, and so if we try to get a picture of what the home is really all about, we often, in a property theory way, think of it as being this isolated kind of unit in a column of space, but it's really interacting with everything around it, okay? Both sort of emitting different impacts on the environment and absorbing impacts from the environment. And that's both good news and bad news. The good news is there are many things we can do to improve housing that we might not necessarily think about at first blush as being about housing. The way we organize space in our cities, the way that different land uses and infrastructure connect to each other. This is also housing policy. The bad news is that there's many ways that our policies can unwittingly choke off housing services. Okay, now, why can't people get what they want and need from housing? Well, there's a variety of rigidities in the system that keep supply from responding, as we might expect, to demand. And so one is just the physical stickiness of the built environment. When stuff is already built up, it may seem harder to imagine how to add in additional things and additional uses. This actually turns out to probably be the least of our worries. There's also political obstacles to developing more housing. Everybody knows the acronym NIMBY now, and resistance among incumbents to new housing, and often resistance coming not only from homeowners but also from renters. There's lots of legal constraints around housing. Some of these are important for controlling externalities, important for protecting people, but some of them end up just withdrawing options. And there's also some psychological and social barriers that create rigidities, kind of failures of imagination around housing. Okay, so because we're in a law school, we'll talk a little bit about the legal constraints, and one way to conceptualize them is that they remove some options from the spectrum of available housing options. They might do this in a variety of ways, through different kinds of minimum standards, how big a unit has to be, minimum parking requirements, zoning that limits what housing can be where, limits on reconfiguring your housing, taking your single-family home and breaking it up into a fourplex, for example. Limited property forms, the numerous clauses that you may have heard about, is about kind of limited template of property possibilities, which tends to prioritize rootedness and permanence. There's also limits on financing and risk arrangements. Again, sometimes necessary guardrails, but sometimes removing options. So if we think about our housing possibilities, and this is just a little bit of a dramatization here, we could imagine different kinds of things like our minimum standards, our zoning restrictions, and numerous clauses, financial restrictions, taking bites out of our spectrum of possibilities. So I want to suggest that our goal is to try to think about bringing back more options and doing it in a way that has appropriate guardrails. Okay, so what do I have in mind? Well, I want to talk about 5 areas briefly. One is to make housing itself more adaptable, kind of explores ways to do that. Secondly, think about more options for more kinds of households. Then think about ways to reconfigure cities to foster life cycle living, ways to make housing finance more flexible, and then how to support portability. Okay, so let's start with the first, making housing itself more adaptable. We can imagine sort of a science fiction idea of the fluid house that is built out of materials that just kind of morph and change shape and adapt. We aren't really there yet in terms of material science, but we do have very old school ways that we can work with housing to make it more adaptable. And so I was excited to see that this idea of multi-generational and adaptable living spaces made this list of 11 thoughts for designing homes for 2040 and beyond. It barely made the list, but it did make it. Most of the things on the list were things that were very high-tech, like AI compatibility, drone compatibility, robot compatibility, virtual reality spaces, and so on. But this is probably the most important thing on the entire list. Okay, so let's think about what adaptability means. One thing that adaptability can mean involves the ability, structuring housing in a way that it can be added on to. Okay, and so this is an example of incremental housing that a Chilean architect was sort of helped to pioneer this idea of kind of building part of a house and letting the family finish the rest of the house. That allows for expansion over time. Something similar is often done with the bungalow structure, which Chicago has lots of. And here there's like a 1.5-story structure that often it's possible to fill in the half-story in the dormers with bedrooms as you add kids. So we have some ways of trying to expand space as families grow. But of course, we need to think not only about growing, but also about other ways that the household might change, including shrinking. Okay, so an idea of scenario buffering is one that has been raised by Stuart Brand in his book, How Buildings Learn, What Happens to Them After They're Built. Here's a quote from Christopher Alexander that talks about how as life in a building changes, we need to have the space shrinking and swelling. Stuart Brand here sort of says all buildings are predictions, all predictions are wrong. We need to figure out how to buffer against different scenarios. I do want to suggest, though, that in the context of life cycles, the predictions are a little bit more predictable in some ways. They're not that every household goes through the exact same pattern, but there's some recurring patterns, especially if we look society-wide, that can help us to think about what sorts of scenarios are going to commonly play out in terms of needing more space, needing less space, and so on. So let's think about how that might work. Growing and shrinking over the life cycle is something that some architects have tried to think about how to do. This is one kind of schematic example of how a single-family home might be broken up into separate modules, separate living units that could be kind of combined or separated as time goes by in order to allow for some different units within it. Now, I want to note that thinking about our legal restrictions, this is likely to be illegal in many jurisdictions in a single-family zone to do something like this, although we're starting to see some movement on that front legally. Here's another sort of visualization of how the life cycle might lead to adaptation from the Adaptable House book. Here we have the idea that young married owners could have like a little suite that's their own living space and might rent out the rest of the larger unit, then take it over as they add children, and then later, maybe as the children leave, they revert back. So having some kind of a way of adding or subtracting space. Here's a very specific example of this idea that comes from a book about co-housing. Here's the idea that you could have two units side by side that have some rooms in between that could be either given or taken from either side. So we might start off on the left, a couple with older children that is using these bedrooms for their unit, a retired couple next door that doesn't need as much space. Then at some other point, it might flip where you'd have, as you can sort of see the way I'm using the color coding to divide up the space here, where you might have the right-hand unit need more space, left-hand unit less, or even just sort of split the rooms like in the other example. So notably, this is being proposed inside of an intentional community, co-housing, because the law really isn't set up very well to structure ownership or leases in this way that would allow for this flexibility. And we might also wonder about whether it would really work out this well or this neatly, like would they really grow and shrink in synchronicity? But if we think about the idea conceptually and think about how we might have like a development that had a lot of flexibility like this, we might think about how we could restructure things to allow for that. We might imagine some rotation among proximate households that would allow for this kind of life cycle adaptation. Okay. So some simple things that might be done, and this is kind of like this expression, over provision of doors. Some simple things that might be done that might be built in to housing to make it easier, to make it more flexible, to make it easier to divide it up or combine it would be simple things like just having, extra doors. And then you're able to do more with segmenting the space. Okay. So next I want to say a little bit about more options for more kinds of households, and especially how to accommodate this growing sector of single-person households. Okay, so one idea that, well, first I want to show you this graph that kind of talks about the ways that households are changing over time. And on the right-hand side, it's kind of showing the increase in single-person households mapped against the decrease in the percentage of nuclear family households. Okay, and so on the left, there's some statistics about kind of how households are configured. But one thing I want to flag here is that this comes from a report that was put together by AARP, the entity formerly known as the American Association of Retired Persons. And the AARP, pretty powerful political lobby, has taken a leading role in researching housing and trying to advocate for more housing types. And so this is kind of what I mean when I'm thinking about elder housing potentially offering a political way of getting into more flexibility. Okay, so one trend that AARP has been quite active in is the loosening of restrictions around accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, that people might put in their backyard, for example. Okay, so number of states and localities have now allowed, as of right, ADUs, including in Champaign, as I'll talk about in a minute, and they can be occupied as separate dwelling units on a single-family lot. NIMBY, not in my backyard, has, at least to some degree, in places given way to PIMBY, parents in my backyard. There's different ways that you can configure ADUs. They can be sort of put in on an attic space, or like attached above a garage, or a detached area, or whatever. There's different ways that they could be configured. But the idea is basically to add some additional living unit, which can be very helpful in a life cycle kind of approach, because it allows for there to potentially be older or younger people living in a separate dwelling unit, and then having the main unit that others are occupying. There's several complications here, and legal restrictions really vary with respect to these ADUs in terms of what's permitted and what's not. In some places, it's actually restricted so that the people who are in the ADU have to be related to the people who are in the main unit, which is pretty constraining. It might work for this parents in my backyard situation, but if we're thinking about how to add more housing options generally, it might be better to just have open-ended additional ADUs. It might be that some people don't want to literally live in their children's backyard, but having a lot of accessible areas in the area would be valuable. So maybe it should really be people in my backyard. There's some other barriers here, and as some of you may know, that in Champaign in 2022 had legislation to allow ADUs. This is a screenshot from their discussion of that, how they presented the proposed changes. And basically, they would be allowed. They are allowed due to this legislation on any property that's zoned for residential uses with some various restrictions attached. But many of you may not have noticed this change, possibly, because, at least according to this article from March of 2024. None of this has been built. There's been no additional ADUs added on, and actually no applications for any ADUs either. So various reasons have been cited, financial reasons, and this sort of prefigures something we'll talk about in a minute about more flexibility in financing. But there's also questions about whether it's just a lot, like a big lift, for someone who is a single-family homeowner to figure out everything that you need to do in order to add an ADU. And so we might think that the individual property owner doesn't necessarily have a comparative advantage in adding housing. What we might really need is some kind of prepackaged product that would put together everything that someone would need to actually make an ADU a reality. Financing, architectural assistance, logistical support, help with the paperwork, connections to contractors, and so on, in order to actually make it meaningful. There also may be some private covenants in some places restricting this kind of use, and those would stay in place under the legislation. So there can be other barriers as well. Okay, so another idea that has gained a lot of traction is to take away some of the legal restrictions, minimum size restrictions, so that it's more possible to have very small apartment units, very small dwelling units. And so this kind of micro unit idea has gained some traction. And here we'd basically be able to let the people who are good at developing housing develop housing and develop more types of housing. This is an example from a model micro unit development. Here's a photograph of one of the units. And this is 160 square feet or 150 square feet of living area. That's about the size of a standard parking space. Okay, so pretty small. Traditionally, local governments have generally limited, had a minimum size for apartments of being, maybe somewhere in the 220, 250 square foot range. So this is smaller, and there's beginning to be experimentation with allowing this. This particular example has a lot of things that kind of fold out of the walls and fold back in, like the bed and the table and everything as you go through your day. Has a nice view of the Bay Bridge and kind of nice high-end finishes, but very small space. And so there are questions around kind of how small is too small and so on. We're also seeing updated versions of what's been kind of rebranded as co-living, sometimes called adult dorms, and it's really kind of a new take on the single room occupancy unit that that was a model that often was outlawed in many jurisdictions, that sort of traditionally tended to house mostly low-income single men with like kind of a hot plate in their room and a bathroom down the hall. But there's been kind of an effort to reimagine these spaces and think about how they could be made appealing and clean and be places that would really add housing stock by allowing for very small units that people would actually live in, and then ample use of common space, like the restroom, showers, laundry, some of the storage, the kitchen area, and even the sitting areas would be kind of external to the little sleeping area, which would be very, very small, similar in size to the micro units that we saw before. Okay, so that's another idea, and in some places would require legal change. Now, one thing we might think about for elder housing in particular is to what extent this could be kind of combined with various levels of assisted living or various levels of assistance in terms of helping out with the meals and helping out with cleaning and other things in these common areas. We could imagine having buildings where some of the floors are like this and some have varying levels of assistance, and other floors are instead just more traditional small apartment units or apartment units for families. So we might think about that as kind of a way to integrate some assisted living into a building that wouldn't have to be entirely like that. Okay, another possibility that we might think about when we're thinking about options for elder housing is the possibility that even though we have lots of single-person households, they might get together and share a home, a la Golden Girls, right? So here again, we often run into some restrictions legally about unrelated people living together. So just to give you an example, here or nearby in Urbana, there is a limit of no more than 4 unrelated people living in a house. And this is a screenshot from the University of Illinois website, Student Affairs, about off-campus community living, emphasizing that if you rent a house with other people, you have to sign a sworn statement that you won't have more than 4 unrelated people living in the house. Landlord also has to sign a sworn statement. And here are some cautions saying, don't sign it if it's not true. And if you do, you could face criminal charges for perjury if there is some kind of inspection that turns up that more people are living there. Okay, so this probably is targeted at student groups, but because it applies to any group of unrelated people, it would potentially reach older people as well. And so we might think about other ways to regulate uses to address the concerns of the neighbors, like maybe better enforcement of noise ordinances or parking restrictions or things like that. Now, the actual Golden Girls, I will say, would be okay in Urbana because because there are only 4 of them. I think 2 of them were actually related to each other. But, you know, once you go beyond that sort of sitcom scenario, you know, all bets are off and you might not be able to get a house in Urbana. Okay. Now, another idea that has been pioneered, and this is an example from Boston, a partnership between Boston and some other organizations, is the idea that older people that have like extra space in their house could share their home with younger people. And there's also this kind of overlay in this that there would be these wonderful interactions, such as in the picture, between the different generations, kind of a synthetic intergenerational household for people who maybe don't have their own elders or younger people handy to do that. And a book about housing I was looking at recently, Diana Lynn's Brave New Home, has a pretty glowing write-up of this idea and notes that a nesterly host can propose, for instance, 8 hours per month of yard work or pet care help for a $50 reduction on the rent. Okay, now this sort of set off a few red flags inside of my mind, which is like, wait, that's below the minimum wage. And are we concerned about these kinds of sort of hybrid personal business relationships that involve actually having somebody's ability to remain in where they're living kind of potentially compromised by someone demanding them to do various chores or whatever. So we want to worry about like having some guardrails in place. It seems it has a lot of feel-good vibes to it, and it might be good in concept, but think about ways to sort of structure this so that we make sure that it works out fairly for everybody involved. Okay, so I next want to talk a little bit about how to reconfigure cities for life cycle living. When we think about the residential services that people seek, a lot of these, as I mentioned before, are fulfilled outside of the 4 corners of the home itself. And so we might think about how that happens. There's lots of things that might be provided in the home that you might find a way to do it within the footprint of your living space that you also might be able to fulfill outside of the home in various ways. And that's going to depend on kind of what's available outside of your particular unit. Now, of course, we're all familiar with private communities that kind of pre-package some of the services that are available outside of the individual unit and offer things such as pickleball or whatever it might be. But it's also more generally true that we might think about our cities, our communities, in terms of what they offer to residents outside of the 4 corners of their particular dwelling unit. Okay, so one simple idea is just, is there access to places for like running and riding bikes, for example? Here's some visualizations. These are increasingly possible because everybody wears these monitor tracker things, and so you can kind of tell where people are running. I was able to pull up one about Champaign and Urbana, where do people bicycle? So we could think about this as being part of housing policy. Like, are there places where people are able to exercise outside of the home? Are they proximate to where people live? We might also think about other kind of infrastructure-related things, such as sidewalks. So Chicago, traditionally in Chicago, every homeowner, every property owner is responsible for shoveling outside of their own dwelling. But however, they're pioneering this project, this pilot project, that would actually have the city come and plow the sidewalks in some particular neighborhoods to kind of see how that goes. And one of the criteria that they're using for picking neighborhoods for this is the concentration of individuals over 65. Okay, so a snow-filled sidewalk is inconvenient for everyone, but it can actually be a big accessibility impairment to someone who's older, maybe is using a wheelchair or a walker or something like that. So having a way to just make the sidewalks be more accessible could make a big difference in terms of housing policy. Another idea I saw recently that I think is a great one is in places where people need to cross streets, have a way that you can get, they call it the green man here in the UK, but have a way to get the longer green man, have a longer period of time to cross the streets. And again, this is something that can potentially be helpful for people at various times, even if they aren't elderly. Some people just might need a little longer to cross. Sometimes I'm trying to cross the street with one of my elderly dogs or something like that, and having a little extra time would be incredibly helpful. Okay, so another thing that we might think about when we're thinking about our cities, which are already built up, is ways to reconfigure the space so that some of the prime areas that are most proximate to other goods and services in the community are actually available for housing. So there's been a lot of attention given to the idea of converting office space to housing, with there being a decrease in demand for office space. This is something from a design competition that was kind of looking at how to adapt a building that was set up initially for offices. And the big problem, one of the big problems, is that there's not typically enough windows to make like lots of legal bedroom spaces or living spaces, because there's going to be a requirement of there being windows, and offices often just have a lot of space that doesn't have access to a window. So they're sort of looking at how you could like carve out part of it and like put the extra density on top. This is a little bit of a speculative conceptual thing, but we could imagine doing some of these things. It also shows some of the challenges of these kinds of conversions. But other kinds of buildings are also being now converted. And so thinking about how that might work, I think, is very, very helpful in thinking about how people could get access to the services in their community that they need. This is an example from Ohio where a school was repurposed as a senior community. Other examples are shopping malls that are being retrofitted as apartments. Again, might be something that would be good for single-person households generally. Additionally, hospitals. Hospitals are a little better than offices in terms of having a layout already that is going to have a lot of room for access to windows. So that's another possibility. And even prisons are being converted into apartments. We might wonder about how well this would work, but at any rate, it's an idea, and I'm all in favor of ideas. Let's think about how we can use spaces better and be able to reconfigure things in a way that will make them useful. Okay, so I wanted to give one more conceptual idea about how to reconfigure space within a city, and thinking about how the law might support reconfigurability. So let's imagine that we have some blue houses here on single-family lots, and over time, it's an area that would really benefit from densification. Okay, having some additional uses in the area. And so, of course, we are all familiar with eminent domain, kind of a brute force solution of if you want to just move some stuff out of the way and put something else, you can do it. It's very politically costly, has lots of drawbacks. A related idea, land readjustment, has been used in other countries more than in the US, and might be a helpful approach to think about. Here's kind of essentially what it might look like. Is let's say that we kind of allow everyone who is currently living there to have a right to remain in the community, and they'll still be able to occupy space that's at least as valuable as what they had before. They could have an option, of course, to also just cash out and leave if they wanted. But the idea would be to find a way to have reconfiguration be part of the story without necessarily displacing people. And we could add some more uses. We could imagine these being maybe not just single-family homes anymore, but maybe taller towers or something like that. And this would be a way of potentially loosening up some of the way that property works in cities. And you could imagine even having an opt-in kind of approach where people choose to be in a community where they know that the land might be readjusted later and that they'll have these various options. Making things reconfigurable from the start, I think, is a very important move for us to explore. Okay. So next I want to talk for just very briefly about housing finance, making it more flexible. I'll be happy to talk in Q&A more about this. Because we don't have too much time, but I wanted to just mention there's lots of different financial services people look for from their homes. I mentioned this briefly before. Sometimes they need liquidity, especially older people might need liquidity from their home. They might be, younger people might be wanting to leverage wealth building, various ways of using the home to self-insure against expenses by savings, and then sort of at the bottom, we have this idea of assets to share, bequeathable assets. We can maybe look at this a little bit more schematically. We can imagine on the left, sometimes older people are kind of house poor. They have valuable real estate, but they might need money for living expenses. There's a way to, sort of get money out, reverse mortgages, home equity loans, and other things, other kinds of instruments that can potentially do that. Sometimes what's needed is instead some money to support something that might actually be income earning on the property, like an ADU or even a home business. In other cases, people are really looking to use their home as more like a piggy bank for savings and have it as this kind of available source of a way of having security against unexpected events. And the idea that there's sort of a hammer somewhere that can break this open under particular circumstances. But kind of alongside all of this, I think this is very important, a lot of people have a picture in their mind of the home as this thing that they want to keep intact, debt-free, and give to their children. Okay, now, needless to say, you cannot do all these things with your home. You can't shake all the money out of it and also give it debt-free to your children. So I think the most important thing I would say in the financing domain is being clear on the kinds of services people want, what their priorities are about them, and then finding the right kind of product to deliver what it is that they actually want from their home. And some of this may get to questions of, do we need to maybe rethink our relationship to housing and whether existing houses necessarily need to be handed down in their exact format intact. Maybe there's other ways for bequeathing to the next generation that doesn't necessarily involve that. But at any rate, that's, I think, the important thing is to recognize that we do have financial tools that can do all these things. We should be very flexible in allowing them to do these various things and should have appropriate, obviously, guardrails for it, but recognizing that they can't all be done kind of simultaneously. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is how housing policy can support portability. Okay, so the previous ideas have largely focused on how to make housing and its surroundings work better through the life cycle as needs change, different spatial needs, proxemics needs, financial needs. And one thing that is often cited about older people is that they often at least express a desire to age in place. And so it makes sense to kind of look at how can we make that work. However, another way of adapting to the life cycle is to have it be easier to move to a new location, if that's the thing that ends up making the most sense to do. Okay, and so there have been some attempts to make housing itself more portable. Here's an idea going back to Le Corbusier, flexible housing, that's highlighted in this flexible housing book that has this bottle and rack principle where you'd actually like drag out the housing unit and then you could just go take it somewhere else and put it in another place. And there's actually a company, a startup that tried to do this. They had these little housing units that could be put onto trucks and moved to a different city. Now, this was very creative. It got a lot of press. It ended up failing as a business idea. So just so you know, here's an article, The Little House That Couldn't. And, they had difficulty scaling. They had difficulty being funded. They also had difficulty, apparently, it turned out to be very costly and complex to move the units beyond like 150 to 200 mile radius. It was just too much. So we might ask ourselves then, maybe we could get some of the benefits of portability without like literally moving the house. So one of the longtime critiques of this approach is that it really requires more structural stability. It's costly. You have to have a structure that can survive without the things slid into it, and the things that are slid into it have to survive as they're being moved around. And so maybe it would be better to have something that is what I'm calling here portability mimics. Other ways of countering lock-in that can enable people to move to a place that will feel more like home. Some of the ways this can be done is if there's networks that exist in different places that people can plug into that are similar to what they have seen before. Now, sort of a maligned aspect of this is like chain restaurants that exist everywhere. You can always find a McDonald's. But we can imagine it for things like the YMCA or other things, that ways of plugging into volunteer opportunities, other things that reduce the costs of moving for people in terms of the transaction costs of getting up to speed in a new location. We could think more about portable mortgages, mortgages that can be transferred to a new home or assigned to new owners of one's old home. So you don't get locked in when there's a changing interest rate environment just because your mortgage is keyed to an interest rate that's better than what you could get getting a new mortgage. Housing assistance that's not unit specific or that can be ported. Here, we might contrast something like rent control, where people get locked into a particular house and stay in it, a particular housing unit, and stay in it maybe long past the point where it is the best fit for them, with something like vouchers that would allow for more portability. Coordinated moves by a family or group of neighbors. My colleague Lee Hilovitz wrote a little piece about this, co-location covenants. And there's starting to be some examples out in the world, not necessarily family groups specifically, but other needs for coordinated moves to occur. There's recently been in Alaska, due to climate change, the need for some towns to just move due to flooding. And so they've just sort of tried to move the whole town. So if we think about ways of moving that bring the context with you, that retain the kind of relative position to what's important, that could be more important than remaining rooted in a particular physical location. Okay, so one particular policy that I think is a pretty important one is how pet policies relate to portability. I think it's pretty important for a lot of people generally, a lot of older people, maybe especially older people who are single-person households. If they have a beloved pet, this could be a big impediment to moving into a more suitable housing situation if their pet is not portable. Okay, and we already have Fair Housing Act protections that recognize emotional support animals as potentially being a reasonable accommodation. So it'd be a pretty short step to have there be broader protection for the portability of pets, to allow there to be that kind of portability. I think might be a very important aspect of maintaining quality of life for people, and might push against some of the, break down some of the resistance that people have to moving generally. Okay, so the bottom line here, and I am at the end, is that flexibility is not just for the elderly. I've talked about ways to make housing more flexible so it can adapt through the life cycle. And again, I think that because looking at it in the elder law context can potentially get us to a place where there might be more political will to change things, we can think about how flexibility might work better for everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So we will indulge just a few questions. Yes? So if you have a question, please step up to the microphone. I think that there'll be a nice queue. Please.
Hi, so it seems to me like one of the principal problems of housing is that we've kind of like hyper commodified something that we need to live. And I'm wondering if the market can really solve this problem. And I'm wondering, why not just build more public housing in a high density area? I used to live in East Berlin. There was lots of high density housing. They're near transit corridors, grocery stores, hospitals. There were lots of communities. And I know in Vienna, 500,000 people live in public housing. That's really nice.
Yeah.
And that I think people would live in. And to me, it just seems like the market pushes towards scarcity because that increases the value. So I'm just not sure how this is going to be solved through a market-based solution.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And you're quite right that that there are different arrangements in other countries, and Vienna is kind of a model of how to do social housing because they have a very large percentage of their population that lives in social housing, and they also have the feature that you don't get sort of kicked out of social housing when you start to earn more money. So it's much more economically diverse and so on. So there's lots of things, and I'm a big fan of looking at ways to do things with our housing assistance to make it work a lot better. And so certainly I'm in favor of all of those things. I think partly I'm trying to think about what are the moves that we might be able to make from where we are. And here, I think it's important that there is a growing recognition that the kind of housing that we have, the kinds of housing stock that we have, is mismatched to what the demand is. And also, I think, a growing recognition of how that is really not only just creating inequities, but also just inefficiencies. It's making it impossible for people to move to cities that where they can be productive, and it's essentially forcing people out of areas. And so that I think is a crucial aspect of all of this. But I think the political barrier is the most difficult one here. That there are market forces that can be helpful in the sense that when we have a lot of excess demand and not enough supply, right, the prices go up, and the normal reaction is that there's more supply that's built. And so in part it's about like trying to get the political will to let that process happen and let it happen everywhere it needs to happen. It shouldn't be, a totally unguided process in all regards. It's very important to have housing where we need it, and the social housing aspect of it is truly important. But yeah, I think part of it's just trying to gather the political will to let that happen.
Hi, I don't know if this one's on. I'll just project. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you. This was a great lecture. I really enjoyed listening to it. And I think your ideas are really, this is all novel. This is very unique. And you've kind of touched on this, but I wanted to ask it directly. I think that the American home, as you said, has kind of become part of the American dream, right? The single-family home. And I think a lot of people strive for that. That's a lot of people's goals. And we talked about like getting the political will, but how do you convince someone or a group of people who kind of have that as like the symbolic, like I made it? How do you like leverage that with these concepts of we need to be more flexible and we need to open our minds to more than just that one image we have?
Yeah, so part of it might be something that will happen as we have changing. So it's often generalizations about different generations. I'm never sure like what to believe, but you kind of do hear that younger generations are maybe less interested in buying homes. Partly it's because they're so expensive, but that there might be interest in more flexible or different kinds of arrangements. And so to the extent that we think about this as a life cycle issue where decision making ends up being intergenerational, to the extent that there's changing tastes or pressures from younger generations, that could be part of the story for sure. It also may be that if we look at mismatches where, and so some people have kind of written about this idea that maybe we'll end up with too many large family-sized homes in the suburbs relative to what people want. And if that's the case, then ultimately it may be very much in the interest of those who own those homes to figure out how to change around those homes, to either break them up into more units or support having more development near them or other kinds of things that would make things more flexible. So I think a lot of it comes down to kind of the pressures of the demographics generally, and maybe changing tastes are going to maybe gather some interest in trying to change around the way that things will work. And if we have a large cohort that is interested in doing things, I mean, I guess the main thing I would say is that the problems are all sort of human origin, and they all can be fixed by people too.
So I have a question about something that's been in the news a lot, which is massively flexible housing that actually is making the problem worse. So Airbnbs
Yeah.
are pretty much the definition of flexible housing, but people identify that as actually a cause of housing unaffordability. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I think it's a hard question. I think that the Airbnb sort of situation is kind of a symptom of a larger housing shortage problem. And so the fact that there's competition coming from tourists, right? I mean, this is very, very troubling in places where there's not enough housing for the people who want to live in the area. And I think the basic answer is we need a lot more housing. And so having a lot more housing would allow for there to be flexibility in that housing. Currently, when we have tightly constrained housing, we can see, you know, legal restrictions around maybe having not super short-term rentals, but it also interacts with other decisions like what hotels are available in an area. You know, what are the economic implications of having people come to the area or not come to the area? So Airbnb, I have a little bit of mixed feelings about. I think that one thing it shows us that is valuable is that it's possible for this kind of excess capacity in a home to be used in a very useful way. And so that's something that I think is an important lesson that the platform has shown us. And then it's kind of a question of how can we work with that and also work on this other front of allowing more housing development generally.
I had a question about this political aspect. You had said that you think that there's possibilities for thinking about this in terms of life cycles for like elderly people to be more of a positive in terms of housing affordability. My impression, I mean, I don't want to get into like generational wars, but my impression is that a lot of like for elderly people, because they have a lot of their equity built into their home, that you actually get a lot more pushback usually. So I'm just curious if you can expand on what you meant by how we can sort of enlist, I guess, people who vote more frequently to support laws that would increase housing affordability.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I see the political involvement of AARP on some of these issues as being kind of a welcome sign that they're kind of interested in looking at ways to loosen up housing supply in particular ways. You know, you're quite right that homeowners generally who have a lot bound up in their home. This is a basic problem with the fact that people have most of their wealth portfolio in their home. And this makes them incredibly risk averse. It makes them want to do things that will preserve that high home value, which can include like excluding competing homes and other things like that. So that's very real. That's been the situation for a long time. I think what maybe is changing a bit is just that the mismatch between the kinds of space that is needed and the kinds of arrangements that are needed may become large enough that, not to say that every older person who owns a home is going to be on board, but some of the older people that do own homes are interested in finding ways of getting money out of them for living expenses, for example. And finding ways to do that also may support kind of looking at ways to add additional units or add additional flexibility around the home. So I think there is space to do this. It's not to say that there's not going to be pushback, but it seems like it's at least a potential source of some additional support for changes, maybe from an unexpected quarter, for the very reasons that you say, that we might often kind of think, oh, you know, older people, they're set in their ways and they're just going to want to stay where they are. And, you know, if it turns out that it's going to be difficult in terms of where they're located and the amount of space that they have for that sort of to be the equilibrium situation, then we might start to get some moves off that equilibrium. Basically anything, whether it's demographic or something else, that kind of creates a little bit of a perturbation in our equilibrium around housing, which is a very sticky supply constrained equilibrium, at least has the potential to get us somewhere better.
You mentioned lock-in and trying to decrease lock-in, and one of the lock-in situations that I'm more familiar with is with people trying to age in place in rural areas, mostly because they don't really have a lot of options. Changing demographics mean that there's not the value, like the sale value in the home, but they still have that use value, but there aren't the services that you also mentioned.
Right.
So it's losing both its economic value and its service value, but they're kind of stuck. Like, can you maybe address that?
Yeah, so I think it's a big issue, kind of a locational mismatch. If people are in places, especially if they don't have the same access, maybe to driving or whatever else that would allow to get to the places that are going to be where they're going to be getting various services that they need. Yeah, so I think finding ways to make it easier for people to move from those situations into better situations is a very important part of it. I guess there's two basic ways to go about it, like conceptually. One is about bringing the services to the people, right? Kind of having more of an emphasis on how to have distributed density, maybe, that is out in other areas where you're building up a particular area in a way that makes it more of a standalone community and easier to access services. So that might be more development in an area. The alternative would be kind of actually the moving idea, like let's just try to support moving from areas that are not able to serve people at this particular point in their life very well into places where it's more possible. And that is where having more like options for smaller households becomes really important when we think about moving into areas that are maybe more expensive areas, more in-demand areas. Just adding the supply to meet that demand in those places, I think, is an important aspect.
Great. Any other questions? Professor Fennell, thank you so much. This was
Oh, thanks, everybody. It's a lot of fun.
And as a token of gratitude for you traveling back to Champaign, this is our parting gift.
Thank you so
everybody
much.
in
Oh,
person and
that's
online for
beautiful.
attending. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That was very successful.
I wanted to share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
I wanted to share with you because I think you would think this is interesting. I participated in undergrad in a program called the Student Artist in Residency Program, where I lived in a retirement home and part of my undergrad. And this whole thing made me think about that because it's very adjacent. Because in that context, it was like, here's a need, students need housing, they can't afford it, and here's the retirement home population who is